Crossing the Han River by Li Ping. Beyond those southern peaks, no news or letters. I was gone a winter, and again a spring down there. Now, nearing home, I grow a little nervous, afraid to question people I meet along the way. So we continue with more poets that have only one poem in this anthology. So today's poem is attributed to Li Pin, but it's not a certain authorship. In fact, I've read, and a lot of people also attribute this poem to Zhang Jiwen. So it could be either of them. It's not clear who wrote it. So in the case of Song Jiwen, we've already talked about him. You will remember that he was one of the intellectual stars in the court of Empress Wu Zetian, the only Chinese reigning women empress in imperial history, and a woman who tried to usurp the throne from the Tang after the death of her husband. So when Wu Zetian retired, some of her supporters were banished to different regions. This was the case of Song Jiwen. He was sent south, to the extreme south, and in the end forced to commit suicide there, close to present-day Vietnam. So he might be the author of this poem, in which case this poem would be a relatively early one, that is to say an early Tang, probably 7th century poem. Or another possibility would be that it belongs to Li Pin. Not much information about Li Pin is available. He was a late Tang figure who flourished mainly in the second half of the 9th century, from let's say 850 to 870. And we know he had a series of minor posts in the provinces and practically nothing else about him. Okay, let's go to the poem then. What's the topic of the poem? Well, it's called Crossing the Han River. The Han River is one of the affluents of the Yangtze, and you could say it's in the middle center area of today's China. But the poem doesn't talk really about the river at all. The situation that is described in the poem might include the poetic persona crossing through that area in his direction back, probably to the capital or to the place where his relatives live. But actually the main topic of the poem and the main image is the return of the exile. So we've talked about this topic before when Tang scholar officials fell from office because of courtly intrigues or cliques or for any other reason. Well, they could be executed, but for the most part, the government preferred to send them to exile to remote regions. Now, during the Tang dynasty, the most remote regions were, well, you had remote regions in the north, but you also had them in the south. The area of what today is called Guangdong, with Canton or Guangzhou and Hong Kong, that southern province of China, was, at the time of the Tang dynasty, a recently colonized territory. Except for the main city of Guangzhou, that territory was mostly, from the Chinese perspective, a barbarian wasteland. It was very far away from the heartland, from the capitals. Its climate was tropical, and at this time, tropical climate for northerners implied probability of certain death because of tropical diseases, animal poisoning, etc. So being sent to, the extreme south, these areas which were populated by what the Chinese considered barbarians, with an unhealthy climate and dangerous animals, was tantamount to a death sentence. So here we have the story of one of these persons. The poetic persona could be Li Pin, it could be Zhang Jiwen, or it could be completely invented. But we have this poetic persona of a person who's been banished to the south. We know that he has been to the south because the first line refers southern peaks. In the original, it mentions their name, the Ling Mountains. And the area of the extreme south was called Lingnan in Tang times, that is, south of the Ling Mountains. And as we said, it was, a backwater, even though very few poets and writers of the aristocracy came from there. But significantly, the first poem in this anthology, we mentioned that he was Zhang Zhuling. He came from this area. So going back to the topic of the poem, the topic is about banishment. A poet is returning, or the poetic persona, the protagonist of the poem, is returning from banishment. He spent some time there, and he is worried. Why is he worried? Well, he is worried because his family members might have died. You know, he hasn't received news from home for at least 2 years, and he's afraid that maybe bad news will be received, or, you know, perhaps relatives or his wife or other people have died. Perhaps nobody has died, but he will receive a cold welcome because he has, after all, been condemned to exile, and he might be perceived as a criminal. And I don't think anything else is warranted for commentary. Let's go to the couplets. First couplet. Beyond those southern peaks, no news or letters. I was gone a winter, and again a spring down there. So, you know, the first couplet really presents the situation. The title doesn't, you know, crossing the Han River. You know, it could be any traveler's poem, but this first couplet specifically tells us that this man was in the extreme south, in the area of Lingnan. Perhaps he's been a bit hyperbolic because there were, you know, letters might have reached that area. There was an effective postal service during the Tang Dynasty. But anyway, he didn't receive any letters. He was isolated in the remote south with no news. And it says, I was gone a winter and again a spring down there. So that probably implies he was exiled in winter. He arrived there in spring, and he spent at least 1 year until the next spring. And probably after that, maybe he received an imperial pardon or something of the like. And now he is traveling north again, back home again. And what happens? How is he feeling? So the first couplet actually depicts the situation as such, without any affectivity. It just describes what the situation of the poetic persona has been. It gives us the background. Second couplet, it will give us his feelings. Now, nearing home, I grow a little nervous, afraid to question people I meet along the way. So he's nearing home, so the Han River must be relatively close to his home. As I said before, the Han River was in the area that was already northern China. Well, southern China is, the frontiers vary. Before the Tang, southern China was the Yangtze Basin. During the time afterwards, Lingnan was incorporated, so there was another extreme south. But anyway, the Han River would have been in the south of the north of China. So he's probably getting close to the imperial capital, probably, because from the Han River to Chang'an, it wasn't that big of a distance, relatively speaking. So he's nervous. You know, you wouldn't expect him to be nervous. You might expect him to be happy, exultant, perhaps a little bit anxious, expecting to meet friends and family. But it's worry, the feeling that seems to be crowning his mind. And he is afraid to question people I meet along the way. So I don't know if it's an effect of the translation or of the original, but there is an ambiguity here. He's afraid to ask the people questions, but the people he meets as a traveler. But what questions are the ones he's afraid? So this ambiguity leaves many avenues open. Maybe he's afraid of asking for his relatives or his friends because he fears they might have died, or maybe friends of his might still be suffering exile. He might be afraid of asking about politics, about the administration, about the situation of the country, perhaps fearing that his reprieve from exile might be short. Anyway, it remains an open question, but the image that is really forwarded in this couplet is not the relief at the seas of exile, but the new worries that are connected with the return from exile. So there's a slight paradoxical feeling, a slight paradoxical taste in this poem. There is liberation from exile, but there's no liberation from worries. If it were a poem by Li Ping, we might imagine these worries might be connected with the chaos in which the country was falling in the late years of the Tang Dynasty, if there is a political intention to be read into it. If it were a poem by Song Shiwen, his fears might be the fears of being subjected to further persecution, as was indeed the case. He was repeatedly sent into further exiles after short temporary recalls and in the end forced to take his own life. But anyway, this poem ends with this slightly bitter taste. Yes, happiness at the return from exile, but what uncertainties, what worries might hang upon the mind of a returned exile? So, interesting.